Looking at Year 13 content now, the consolidation of the Republic obviously looks at the rump period after Charles's execution. So just as a recap, the rump are those politicians, nobles and gentry who were kind of instrumental in the execution of Charles I. Now, in February 1649, so a month after Charles's execution, the rump voted to abolish the monarchy completely, despite the fact that Charles had two sons, so Charles II and James II, thereby formally creating a republic. This was then further developed in May to abolish the House of Lords, who mainly consisted of Charles' old advisors. So by 1650, all adult males had to declare loyalty to the Commonwealth, which was then further enforced by the Treason Act of 1650. So it was treasonous in order to state that the Republic wasn't legitimate or democratic, because ultimately MPs started to become elected rather than selected, and ultimately they believed that they needed to reinforce their authority to prevent the return of a Catholic monarch in the shape of either Charles or James II. So Argyll, who was a Scottish Presbyterian, had declared Charles Stuart as Charles II of Scotland in 1650, and this kind of created a renewed Scottish threat because ultimately Argyll and Scotland do not consider the Republic to be legitimate. Ultimately, Charles I had two heirs to the throne, and despite Charles I's actions, this shouldn't unlegitimise the rightful heirs to the throne. So don't forget, the rights to succession was deemed to be a very key important feature of society within the Tudor and later Stuart periods, and ultimately there are two successors to the thrones that have been overwritten by Cromwell, and that's not necessarily deemed to be a legitimate course of action. However, some Irish also backed Charles Stuart after the regicide of Charles I, forcing Cromwell to reassert Protestant influence in Ireland in 1649, and whilst punishing the Catholics involved in the 1641 rebellion. So Cromwell has not forgotten the actions of the Irish in their persecution of 3,000 Protestants at a time of the First Civil War. So Cromwell has purged those involved in that, and Cromwell sieged Catholic strongholds in the period 1649 to 15, executed ringleaders who were not willing to conform to the new republic. Now, there are a couple of swift changes made as a result of this renewed threat in Scotland and having to reassert control in Ireland. One is that Cromwell replaces Fairfax as Commander-in-Chief of the new model army. Fairfax was obviously very reluctant to commit to regicide against the monarchy under Charles I. He only attended one day of Charles's trial, for example, and was not heavily involved in the signatures in Charles's death warrant. Likewise, Fairfax doesn't really want to be involved in a second round of anti-monarchy sentiments. He does not feel comfortable in fighting against the Scots, who were previously allies, over the issue of succession. Hence, that means that Cromwell becomes Commander-in-Chief of the new model army. But likewise with Ireton, he's kind of recropped up his head in the fact that whilst Cromwell has dealt with the Catholic threat within Ireland, he does need to ask his son-in-law Ireton to remain in Ireland to maintain control whilst Cromwell dealt with the Scottish threat, because Ireland and Scotland both kind of emerge as a threat simultaneously, not as a separate issue. So he has to rely upon Ireton, who shares very similar ideology and values to his father-in-law, about how to kind of reassert English control. However, this occupation became necessary to uphold until 1660, which is the end of our period, because Ireland continuously tries to rebel against English domination. So Cromwell's initial campaign in Scotland started poorly, at which he had to retreat to Dunbar. However, despite being outnumbered, Cromwell was able to defeat the Scots in 1650, killing 3,000 people and capturing 10,000 troops. And there's a multitude of reasons for that, really. One is the fact that the Scottish troops were not particularly trained well. Secondly, obviously Parliament took control of both the army and the sea, and with Dunbar being on a coast, Cromwell was able to get supplies to his troops fairly effectively. So by 1650, it's a fairly short-lived threat, but obviously at the time was dealt with as quite a serious threat, is that Cromwell has to deal with both Ireland and Scotland supporting Charles II's succession to the throne from his father Charles I. Charles's attempts to reclaim the English throne, though, faced many challenges, so ultimately we could argue it was doomed to failure from the very beginning. One factor is that he did have a mustering of support of 20,000 troops. That was a very significant position to be in because it meant he outnumbered the new model army. However, 7,000 out of the 20,000 deserted the campaign before it even started, so only 13,000 troops actually crossed the Scottish border into England. Likewise, the army of Scots attracted little support from the English. The English had gone under 2 civil wars. It didn't have the energy with which to promote or participate in another potential civil war. Likewise, Leslie, the Scottish general who was involved at the Battle of Dunbar, appeared uncommitted to the cause. And as a result of that, that could be another reason why the Scots were defeated at the Battle of Dunbar. The Republic was aware of plots as well. The Republic kind of had adopted almost like Elizabethan spy network systems in which any plots which could have benefited the Scottish invasion were discovered and dismantled very quickly. And in addition to that, Charles did not have any foreign aid, so there wasn't particularly any significant threats from other countries abroad, such as Spain or France, coming in to intervene and support his success to the English throne. So Charles's troops were massacred. So at the Battle of Worcester, for example, where Charles and Cromwell's troops met, even though Charles was substantially much more secure in their numbers in terms of military troops, there were 3,000 Royalist army members who died at the Battle of Worcester in comparison to the New Model Army, who only lost 200 troops. So Charles II's threat was a very real threat. The return of the monarchy, the return of a Catholic monarch, because don't forget Charles I's sons were educated as Catholics, but it's a very short-lived one, and the consequence as a positive out of this threat is that unlike Fairfax, who was quite weak politically, he was more of a militant individual, it meant that Cromwell became the secure leader of the Republic, due to his swift action against Charles's attempted coup against the Republic and the parliamentarians and the Rumps.